at 1:10, or that includes the question and answers?
That includes questions and answers. You can finish your presentation 1 or 1:05.
Okay,
but we need
that's lovely. Thank you very much. So welcome to our talk. We've already been introduced, and you know that we work together at the University of Leeds. So I'm just going to begin with a little bit of context. So earlier this year, Jane and I were module leaders on an academic English for postgraduate studies level 3 pre-sessional English for general academic purposes course for international students. It was a really large course. There were 31 teachers, many of whom were part-time, and 340 students, mostly Chinese, with a hefty contribution from the Gulf states as well. And we found ourselves working across at least 4 time zones if we thought about where staff were as well as where students were. So in March 2020, we started to deliver this course online for the very first time. And it was also the first course from the Language Centre that went online. And I think it may even have been the first course from the university that switched to online as well. So it was a massive challenge. We had to do things really, really quickly. And as soon as we started teaching, we realized that working across so many spaces was an issue. And I'm going to explain about spaces in a moment, so you'll know exactly what I'm talking about there. But the issue was very, very quickly, like after the first few days, colleagues reported working longer and harder, far more so than when delivering courses on campus.
So here's a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today. We'll start by exploring some relevant theory, as Denise has already mentioned. We'll then look at that theory in practice on this course that we led together. We'll have a look at some solutions that we implemented, and also some solutions that emerged and the impact that they had on managing spaces and workload. And we'll then discuss some of the lessons that we learnt from this experience, which we have since applied on the separate courses that we both led over the summer, and then a brief conclusion.
Oh, sorry. So I'll begin with some relevant theory. I'm drawing on mediated discourse analysis here, which is really useful for thinking about computer mediated work, because it regards action as belonging to discourse and not just talk or text. So in this diagram, you can see a kind of outline of the main ideas in mediated discourse analysis. And these are discourses, practices, identity, and actions. And this diagram tries to show the relations between them. But if we think about discourses of ways of thinking, being, and doing, these emerge and shape us as we take part in social processes. And taking part in social processes means participating in particular practices. So if we think about teaching, we definitely have an idea of discourses around teaching. What is a good teacher? What is good teaching? What is teaching practice? What is my teaching practice? What's teaching practice in my institution? And this is how we form our identity. And it's how we recognize each other as well as good teachers, or maybe not so good teachers. So somebody earlier today has already mentioned about the notion of being an experienced teacher. An experienced teacher is quite unaware of their practices, actually. They're very deeply sedimented. But when there's a change to practices, as there has been with this very rapid switch to online teaching, then we can't actually immediately use our usual practices. And we think if we focus now on the idea of actions, actions are the sort of components of a practice. we can break a practice down into a sequence of actions which, if they're performed correctly, they're recognizable as practices by other people for whom those practices are the norm. But if you can't perform that practice, you're mentally engaged in what am I doing? How am I supposed to do it? Your attention's very, very focused at that level. Then that's where you feel challenged about who you are as a teacher. And what we noticed was that changing professional practices by moving online, it's challenged existing teacher identities in our team. It displaced our sense of who was who and what was valued in our community of practice. And initially, it was a very discomforting experience, not just for teachers, but for module leaders as well. So where these actions take place, we can call them the 5 spaces of computer-mediated communication, or work in our case. And it's in these 5 spaces where identities are shaped. These 5 spaces are not separate, they're interactive. And there are more than 5, of course, but 5 main ones we considered were the physical spaces where we're working, virtual spaces where participants meet online, relational space created by the state of talk between participants, the screen space, which is what you can see on the screen, and third spaces, which are places that people referred to during the course of interactions. So on our course, we can apply this in the following ways. So we can think about physical space. We were all working from home, including students. There was a blurring of professional with private, which could be uncomfortable. There was a change to working routines. Many of us experienced far more sedentary behaviour, being trapped at our keyboards and screens instead of walking around the campus. And also for students, there was a real, I almost feel that they took advantage of us. We found, for example, that students were walking around outside while taking live classes, or they were at work, or in taxis or restaurants. So all kinds of possibilities emerged from that change in physical space. And that changed our expectations around the teaching and learning experience. And in regard to virtual spaces, we had so many. Our main teaching space was Microsoft Teams, but even with that, we had 2 virtual spaces that we were managing. So one for the staff and one for students, and we were forever flitting between the 2. But there were many others as well. Unfortunately, because of the rapid decision to move online, there was very little opportunity for us as module leaders to make decisions about those spaces. We just went with what we were told initially, and teachers had to adapt immediately. They had very little, in fact, no say, to be honest with you. So straight away, a complete difference between working on campus, where you can decide how you want to organise the space in your rooms, and being restricted to, no, we're using this and this is how you do it. So quite a significant loss of agency, I think. There was also this possibility about getting lost in virtual spaces. Every week we had a staff meeting which was on Zoom, but inevitably somebody would start a Teams meeting. So it was possible to be in 2 meetings at once. And one of the things that was really noticeable was this sense of not having a grip on what you were doing at any particular point. So this notion of distributed attention, that you want to focus on a particular task, but you find yourself distracted from that because you're clicking around in all these different spaces, and you end up making a trail of either writing instructions or making video clips to help people do things So very difficult to set out to do a task with a clear idea of what it entailed. And also this idea of managing different identities in different spaces. There's an overlap between the physical space where you are and the virtual space where you're working, and also the different virtual spaces. So we had sometimes staff accidentally posting messages in the student team that were intended for staff, and you know, that whole kind of your private self and your public self, or different public selves, that's much more complicated. And the ownership of class space, many teachers felt somewhat under scrutiny. One even declared that he felt he was working in a goldfish bowl. So this idea of actually feeling a little bit threatened by going online. We had other teachers, I mentioned many of them were part-time, who had to work out ways of sharing their virtual classroom just to make it less confusing. We were using Teams, and it doesn't keep posts in chronological order. So it just was easier for them to divide up sessions between class channels and class chats. But of course, if they were class chats, only the people in that chat could see them, and we as module leaders couldn't see those chats. So there's kind of tensions all the time between ownership and also working out how to collaborate with students. We tried and failed with so many different platforms. It was almost a weekly thing for the first month that we were trying new ways of collaborating. So it was all work in progress, the managing the virtual spaces. And the final ones, relational space, again, very related to the virtual spaces, deciding whether to have webcams on or off in a class made a big difference with student engagement. So if, for example, you had a student who was at work and didn't have their webcam or mic on, they obviously weren't going to really engage with what you were studying in that session. And other things were more difficult. So taking turns in bigger online meetings is very difficult. So our staff meetings with 33 of us in a Zoom call, we would often have teachers who week after week never raised any points or never said anything. So it's difficult to build a relationship in that sense, especially as we were a bit unlucky. We had such large numbers of students. And a lot of new staff joined our team just before we went online, so we'd never met them. So it was quite hard to build those relationships and feel like you were a real part of a teaching team. And then just the practicalities as we started teaching, that people were using different versions of the software, different hardware, so they could see different things on their screen. And there were many, many wistful references to, oh, but if we were on campus, it wouldn't be like that. So really the overall effect on the workload of jumping around between these different spaces and identities was a significant amount of time spent on puzzling out new practices at the level of mental and practical actions. So deciding where to click, deciding how to do something, teaching yourself how to do something, a lot of increased stress and working longer but with far less tangible results. And that challenge all the time to your sense of being a good teacher. I think this quote illustrates it very well. I'm a very competent teacher, I know I am, but somehow I just can't do what I want to do. So Jane's going to talk about emergent and evolving solutions and their impact.
Yeah, great. So the first solution was a reduction in the virtual spaces that we were using very quickly. We realised that that would make a huge difference. Denise, could you click on, please? Thank you. We also reviewed our asynchronous sessions. We realised it was more important than ever to really put ourselves in the students' shoes and imagine how they would experience each session. And doing that, making sure that the instructions were really clear. Students always knew, for example, where to post their work. That really helped reduce confusion and queries. We also stripped back the engagement required from tutors. So at first, our asynchronous sessions were quite involved. Tutors had to create a post here, set up a chat here, but we very quickly realised that that wasn't sustainable. So we really stripped that back and made sure that there was minimal engagement required from tutors for those sessions. And then in terms of, oh, we've gone maybe a little bit too far.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. So in terms of expectations, we tried to be really clear with students, but also with tutors about what was and wasn't expected. So we had some students, for example, who expected to get feedback from their tutor on every single task and every single asynchronous session. So we had to be really clear and say you're going to get weekly written feedback on, your writing project, but you won't get feedback for every asynchronous session. And we also tried to be really clear about working hours. So some tutors early on felt that they needed to be online all the time, and if a student sent them a message late in the evening, they needed to reply to that straight away. And we tried to make it clear that we weren't expecting that. And also in our staff meetings, we really tried to emphasize that, this was a case of emergency remote teaching. It wasn't what we would normally be doing, and we didn't expect everything to go perfectly. And all we could ask from tutors was that they did their best. And then increased tech support. So we fielded so many queries about technology rather than, pedagogical aspects, the principles of the course. So we used solutions such as screen sharing. So if we had a couple of tutors asking questions about something, we'd say, well, we're going to do a meeting at 3 o'clock, just drop in if you're needing help with this. And then we would share our screen and show the tutors exactly what to do. We also created quite a lot of walkthrough videos, which we've since used on other courses, again, showing tutors exactly where to click and how to do various tasks. And then a solution that emerged that was really important was, so Denise talked earlier about roles in the team, and some of our teachers who were perhaps more novice, less experienced in terms of teaching EAP, but actually had greater technological knowledge and understanding, their profile within the team really changed over the course, and they ended up taking on quite a supportive role and stepping up and helping us to support the other tutors. So that had a huge impact on workload and just, it was so helpful. And then finally, as Denise mentioned earlier, more than 70% of our tutors were on fixed term contracts, and many of them had been recruited shortly before the course in response to the increased student numbers. So we hadn't met them and they hadn't met each other. So one thing that we did was set up one-to-one meetings with one module leader and one tutor in order to build those relationships, and also just offer tutors a chance to let us know about any issues they were experiencing and offer support directly. So all of those solutions did really help. So, there are some caveats here. It might be that some tutors did continue to struggle, but stopped telling us for whatever reason. And of course, it's quite difficult to gauge that online in staff meetings with 33 people. So that is possible. And also it's difficult to say how much the improvement that we saw in terms of managing the spaces and workload was because of these solutions, or how much it was just that tutors had time to get used to using the technology and to settle into the course. However, the feedback that we did have from staff was really positive about all of those steps that we took. And it did seem that workload did become significantly more manageable in the second half of the course. So these solutions do seem to work quite well.
So, Sorry, Jane.
No.
So after that module ended, we both went on to lead separately 6-week summer Presessionals and took away some of the lessons that we'd learned. So one of the things was the idea of teacher agency. I thought it was really important that teachers had the chance to feel a sense of ownership of what they were doing and develop their own practice, actually, and experiment a little bit. So we gave teachers resources as Word documents rather than class notebook documents, because that felt easier for them to adapt, and they could make their own decisions and choices about what particular virtual spaces they were going to use with their classes. And also built in some explicit community building for the students, because it just felt a little bit lacking in the level 3 course that we were doing. So one of the things we did was we had a virtual cafe for students, just a kind of bit of a social space for them, where we planned to have a weekly game or competition or something like that. In fact, we set up a rota, so each day a member of staff would post something social in the student cafe, and just monitor it to kind of keep it alive, if you like, because these things don't take on a life of their own unless you feed them. Unfortunately, it did stay quite teacher-led. I think the students were just very, very busy. It's an intense 6-week pre-sessional that they're on, but they did engage with it. It's just that they didn't really, well, very few of them actually started their own posts. Something that was a bit more successful, I think, in community building was that we, on our course, started some whole team discussion channels, actually, for asynchronous independent tasks. And we had one for speaking, one for reading, one for listening, one for writing. It could be moderated by all the staff. It got rid of some of that confusion amongst students about where they should be posting responses to their tasks. And it was a great space for asynchronous discussion. It was really valued by the students as an additional relational space as well, because it was across the whole module, not just within their classes. And linking back to relational spaces, there were some tutors who felt that their class channels were just places for them to put instructions, and there was very little feedback or warmth or encouragement coming through in their posts. It was all about, remember to do such and such a task, your feedback will be released on such and such a day. So those students, I think, really felt the benefit of having these other channels where they could get encouragement and feedback from peers and from other teachers on the module as well. And we had really, really lively discussions, in particular as part of the library induction. So students watched 2 asynchronous videos about how to search and evaluate sources. And then they had a live, well, kind of live, kind of not live discussion in the reading channel with the librarian, and that was really useful for them. And they posted all kinds of questions which they normally wouldn't have the opportunity to ask in a short library induction. So I think that worked particularly well. And this screenshot that you can see is just a student's reflection on an academic reading circle, and then she's had responses from some other students suggesting what she can do, and one from me and one from another colleague. So it was a success to have those dedicated channels to discuss skills progress through the course.
I'll talk about a few more solutions that we both applied over the summer here. So first of all was flipped learning. I think we already had a flipped learning approach to some extent, but we really emphasised that. So we made sure that we had a really clear course design, the materials were really well organised for students and available in advance. And then on the course I led this summer, every day students would have a PowerPoint with voiceover to work through that would introduce a concept. They would then have a worksheet to complete, which gave them some practice. And then they would have a webinar with their tutor and the rest of their group to really just check their understanding of the concept and try to push their understanding a little further. So flipped learning has been really key. In our student and tutor inductions, we've made sure that the steps to follow for help and support are set out really clearly. So that meant there's a lot of questions that in term 3, so the course we're talking about here, were coming to us as module leaders, hopefully went straight to IT if that was the relevant pathway for seeking support. We made sure that those expectations of students and tutors were really clear from the beginning of the course, from the induction, especially about the quantity of feedback, to manage students' expectations and make sure that they weren't expecting to get written feedback on everything that they did. Next slide, please. And then the role of module leaders. This summer on my course, I set up a weekly question and answer session, which was through Microsoft Teams on the course discussion channel that all students on the course had access to. The module leaders posted every week and said, have you got any questions? And that was a chance for students to ask us questions directly. And the idea was to take some of the pressure off our tutors and make their workload more manageable. We also try to anticipate students' questions and any issues as much as possible and have almost a bank of answers to those frequently asked questions where both students and tutors could access key information quickly. So for example, for our presentation assessments, we had a 6-page document which had every question we could possibly think of and a really detailed answer. So we were able to just direct students there for most of the questions that they had. And then moving on back to Denise for the conclusion.
So our conclusion, I think we may have persuaded you that it's actually quite hard to manage being in at least 5 spaces at once, especially in a sort of emergency situation as we were back in the spring. And teaching online can be more work actually, but we hope that we've shown you some effective solutions that worked for us. So definitely simplifying the number of spaces that you're supposed to be working in at one time. And I think building on those relational spaces, they're 2 key takeaway things for us. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, we're very happy to answer them. Maybe you might have some experiences you want to share yourself or suggest other things, other ways about working online.
Very interesting presentation, Denise and Jane. Thank you very much. So one of the main points of your presentation was that to keep it simple and not bombard students and learners with 1 million of applications. Very good point, very legit. I have a very interesting question from Mirena. We used to study together at the University of Glasgow, teaching English for academic purposes. And she has a really, really interesting point. So her question is, when tutors choose their own virtual spaces, apps, does that not clash with institutional guidelines in terms of GDPR, for example? Like we all know when you choose a platform, you need to think about the legal issues as well nowadays.
Yeah, I can answer that one. They didn't have such a choice, a limited choice. So, you know, we all work within the constraints of what we have. So we have to use Teams, for example. But in terms of smaller choices, it could be, well, I want to use a Microsoft Word document and I'm just going to get the students to collaborate in that document. Or it might be that you want to use a Padlet or something else. So some smaller choices, if you like. but bigger choices like, oh, shall I use Teams or shall I use something else? No, tutors weren't given that much flexibility.
Okay,
After all, the course is designed.
Yeah, some limited wiggle room within the framework you have created, have established as an
Yeah, but I think even having that limited wriggle room increases your sense of agency as a teacher, that actually you found a nice way of doing something that belongs to your teaching practice, and the idea that you can then put that into use in your own classroom. Of course you should be able to do that. Why would we want to take that away from you? But some people felt that had been taken away from them in the spring.
Any other questions? Any other questions, guys? We've got 5 minutes left. I believe it depends on the tutors as well. I mean, when the tutors are suggesting things during staff meetings, of course you can take them into consideration. I mean, we always have someone in a staff meeting who is very, tech oriented, tech savvy, and he's looking into new applications every day. So that's why I really like staff meetings, because you can really share experience.
I think so. And I'm going to refer to a third space here, but I guess if we were teaching on campus in the classroom, teachers would be bringing in different technologies. Some might use Menti, some might bring in Padlet. And I guess that's what we're working towards. Whereas in the spring, there was a lot of panic, and so we were maybe a bit more restrictive back then. But as we've all gained that experience and expertise, we're able to give teachers a bit more freedom now.
A very interesting question from Ben. He asks, is there any concern that teacher freedom means that the students don't get a consistent experience?
I think, we have quality assurance processes in place, the same as we would on campus, and I'm sure every course has that. I guess we don't want our teachers to be robots, just delivering exactly the same material in exactly the same way. I think, we've got really well qualified, experienced professionals working on our team, so we want to kind of show them the respect and allow them to make their own decisions as much as possible. Would you agree, Denise?
Absolutely, yeah. And anyway, in the classroom, students do not have a uniform experience. I don't think you can standardize the classroom experience, really.
Exactly, we're human beings.
Exactly.
We cannot say the same things at the same time. It's impossible. It's impossible.
No.
And I think students appreciate that. Appreciate the fact that each one of us is very, very unique.
Yeah, and even actually when you've got learning materials that you've designed, you hand them out to teachers, they interpret them all differently, but even if they interpreted them all in the same way, there's still the class channel space where the teacher is interacting with the students. And I think I mentioned that some of our teachers didn't really interact much with their students. Others had really vibrant discussions going on. So, you can't standardize, and you wouldn't want to standardize.
No, absolutely. We cannot, arrange everything. It's impossible. It's impossible. Thank you very much for your very, very interesting conversation and presentation. I really like the Q&A sessions. They can become really, really interactive, and sometimes very interesting points arise from our interaction. We're not in a physical conference. We're not in a university on campus interacting over a cup of coffee, but at least we have the opportunity to interact virtually. And I think this is something that technology has given us. Personally, I really enjoy online conferences. What about you?
I think it's been great. I've been to quite a few now over the last few months, and I'm sure we all have, and I've learned so much. And I guess if you had to actually travel to a conference, you might make it to a couple a year, but online it's just so much easier, isn't it? And we can welcome colleagues from all over the world.
We have 2 minutes, and there is like a very last minute interesting question from Julie Butters, and she asks, did any teachers have issues with MSc Teams? If they did, what were the options given to them? Zoom?
So on our course, we actually used Teams for everything except the live sessions. And we used Zoom for the live sessions because we had students with connectivity issues in China. And also Teams at the time, I'm not sure whether that's changed now, didn't offer breakout rooms, which was a nice feature that Zoom had that we really wanted to keep, because those small group discussions are really great for the live sessions. There's so much more opportunity to interact for students.
Yeah, and I think as well, staff had to use Teams because we had a staff team, and that was how we, as module leaders, communicated with staff and how staff communicated with each other. So someone's just mentioned in the chat we weren't allowed to use Zoom because it's not allowed in China. I'm not sure that's correct, because
that's not true. I'm based in China. No, it's not true. It's the only one who's fully available, and you can actually talk with anyone in the world via Zoom when you're based in China. I was able to communicate with my friends in Dubai because, like, I don't know if you know that, like in Dubai, all the video call applications are also banned, and Zoom is the only one available as well. So no, Zoom is working, and it's working better than Skype, in my opinion. All right, ladies, thank you very much. No, Chris, Zoom is available all over China. Thank you very much,
Thanks,
ladies.
Penny.
Thank you.
Thank you.